Hello, my name is Igor Provotorov, and today I want to tell you about CSS grid layout system. CSS grid layout, aka grid, is a two-dimensional grid-based layout system that aims to do nothing less than completely change the way we design grid-based user interfaces. CSS has always been used to lay out our web pages, but it's never done a very good job of it. First, we use tables, then floats, position and inline block, but all of these methods were essentially hacks and left out a lot of important functionalities. Vertical centering, for instance. Flexbox is a one-dimensional system, and CSS grid layout is two dimensions. Flexbox lets content size itself. CSS grid layout relies on defined grid lines. What about CSS grid layout, the basics? We have grid container and grid items inside the grid container. Grid container creates grid context. The grid container is also known as the grid. The grid is made up by two sets of lines known as grid lines. One set of lines define the column of the grid. These lines run along where is known as column axis, and grid rows and row axis. The grid lines together make up what are known as grid tracks. Grid tracks is the space between two grid lines, horizontal or vertical. Grid cell is the space between four grid lines, and grid area is two or more grid cells together. A quick example: if you want to create a grid container, you have this like new value for the display property called grid or inline grid, depending. And if you notice that in comparison to flex box by default align items and columns, whereas by default, if you just drop a display grid, it sets all of the items in rows. So now we're going to start defining a grid. So here we're explaining what's called an explicit grid, and we're telling it to create column tracks and row tracks. So I have two different properties: the grid display grid template rows and grid template columns properties. In this example, we have grid template rows 50 pixels and 100 pixels, and because only two row tracks were defined, heights of items 3 and 4 are defined by the contents of each. In this example, we have grid template rows and 50 pixels and 100 pixels, and grid template columns 19 pixels, 50 pixels, and 120 pixels. So grid items 1, 4, and 3 have fixed width of 90 pixels, 50 pixels, and 120 pixels respectively. But if you're noticing these are fixed width values, and so we're talking about the responsive web's well grid also has this. It introduces a new unit which is really cool, called the ifr or the fraction. So it's very similar to the flexbox unitless values, and ifr represents a fraction of the available space in the across the grid container. In this example, we have two columns defined at 1 FR each, and third column defined at 2 FR. So it's just going to take all of the available space in the grid container, separate it into 3 sections, and then just evenly distribute it across the columns. You can also combine FR with other lengths or values. So FR, RAM, percent, pixels, and others. There is this also min-max function. It is this new function you can use inside of the value when defining grid sizes. So you can tell it to have like a minimum size and a maximum size, and the default value is auto based on like the content. So if you add in content to the second row, it will grow automatically. It is very cool. What about repeating grid tracks? Define repeating grid tracks using the repeat notation. This is useful for grids with items with equal sizes or many items. The repeat notation accepts two arguments. The first represents the number of times the defined tracks should repeat, and the second is the track definition. So in this example we have 3 the same columns and 4 the same rows. You can also combine the repeat function with other track fixed with values or flexible values. So here you have the first and the last columns at 30 pixels, and then in between, instead of defining like 1fr, 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 I'm just saying, ok, let's repeat 3 columns at 1fr, and then it's just going to distribute the available space across the defined columns. Grid gaps, gutters. The grid column gap and grid row gap properties create gutters between column and rows. Grid gaps are only created in between columns and rows and not along the edge of the grid container. Gap size value can be any non-negative length value, pixels, percent, and others. If 2 values are specified, the first represents grid row gap and the second grid column gap. Grid gap is shorthand for grid row gap and grid column gap. One value sets equal row and column gaps. And what about position items by grid line numbers? Another cool thing, if you are able to also position grid items on a grid. These 2 column by 3 row grids results in 3 column lines and 4 row lines. Item 1 was repositioned by row and column line numbers. If an item spans only 1 row or column, grid row, grid column and is not necessary. Grid row is shorthand for grid row start and grid row end, and grid column is shorthand for grid column start and grid column end. Grid area is shorthand for grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, and grid column end. It is very cool. We have only one property, grid area, and property 2/2/3/3. It is very cool. Spanning items across rows and columns. Grid items span only 1 column and row track by default, but can span multiple row and column tracks using the same properties to position them. Set a grid item to span more than 1 column track by setting grid column end to a column line number that is more than 1 column away from grid column start. So in this example we see that grid item 1 uses all widths of container. Grid items can also span across multiple row tracks by setting grid row end. And shorthand properties grid row and grid column can also be used to position. The keyword span followed by the other of columns or rows to span can also be used. So in this example we have grid row 2/span3 and grid column span 4 property. The same thing with column, even crazier. You can take these lines that are numbered and then you can actually like give it names to give it a little more context, and then you can use those names to position grid items. So basic example here is you're taking templates and rows, are defining them with sizes, but you also have these grid names and so line names. So the line name should be surrounded by square brackets and like relative to where they would be positioned based on where you are defining these columns and rows. And it is good practice to, you can name them whatever you want, but it is good practice to use the hyphen start and hyphen end and append it at the end, because there is some like additional implicit added benefits. Multiple names can be assigned to grid lines by adding names within square brackets and separating each with a white space. Position items by line names. It's very cool thing. With named grid lines, items can be positioned by line names and numbers. Referenced line names should not be wrapped in square brackets. Grid row and grid column is shorthand properties also support. Another really cool thing is now you're naming grid areas. You can take like an entire block or a section of a grid and like say I want this to be the header or I want this to be the footer, and then you can like take items and like position them into the appropriate places. So here this is just an example. We have the grid template areas property, and then you're using like the syntax to say I have two columns on the first row, and that entire block I want to name it header, and then on the second row I have content on the left, sidebar on the right, and on the last row I just want the entire block to be named footer. And then while we define these names, you can use these names to then start position and creating the grid. So here I have had our contents header, and I'm using grid row start, row end, grid column start, and properties. The grid row and grid column shorthand properties can also reference grid area names. And the grid area shorthand property can also be used to reference grid area names. It's very cool. So we have one property for content and one property for sidebar, grid area, sidebar. Aligning grid items. Box alignment. CSS box alignment model complements CSS grid to allow items to be aligned along the row or column axis. Justify items and justify self align items along the row axis. Justify items and align items are applied to the grid container and support the following values: out, normal, start, and others. In this example, items are positioned at the start of the row axis by grid property justify item start, justify items center, and justify item stretch. Items are stretched across the entire row axis, and stretch is the default value. In this picture we have align item start, center, and stretched. And items are positioned at the center of the row and column axis by two property justify items and align items center. Individual items can be self-aligned with the align self and justify self properties. So in this example we have three items, and justify self property start, center, and end. It is align self properties, and align self aligns items along the column axis, and justify self and align self by center. Aligning grid tracks. Grid tracks can be aligned relative to the grid container along the row and column axis. Align content aligns tracks along the row axis, and justify content along the column axis. Start aligns column tracks along, and at the start of the row axis is the default value. So justify content start, justify content end, center, and in this picture it is space around. The remaining space of the grid container is distributed and applied to the start and end of each column track. It is very cool. So space between the remaining space is distributed between the column tracks, and space evenly. The remaining space is distributed where the space between the columns are equal to the space at the start and end of the row tracks. Align content start and center, space around, space between, and space evenly. So what does grid support? Look like good support is actually supersonally pretty good. So this is just a screenshot from caniuse.com that I took a couple days ago, and you will notice partial support for ER and Ash. Supersonally, the spec for the grid came from Microsoft, so it's been in development for over 5 years, and because the spec has kind of like evolved, it is kind of falling behind, but I believe my understanding is Ash will catch up. So As you have seen, the CSS grid layout model is powerful because of its code brevity and the fact that you have the power to change the layout order without touching the markup. These features have helped us to permanently change the way we created layouts for the web. So that's all. Thanks for attention. Bye bye.